All right, welcome. We are on part 5, our final part of Dear Church. Um, there's a recap sort of the whole book at the end, so we'll jump straight into our final 2 chapters. So in chapter 10, Lenny Duncan wants to be very clear that the gospel is political. And I appreciate he adds some nuance to that, saying, look, the gospels are written by multiple people and they have many purposes. But he says one of the purposes of the gospels is a political purpose. And he touches on a little bit of that. So I'm going to dig a little deeper and help explain what he's talking about. And so there's 3 areas in which the gospels have political consequence that I'm going to touch on tonight. How Jesus relates to Caesar, how Jesus relates to the temple, and how Jesus relates to the Roman system of patronage. So let's first talk about Caesar. Mark, the first gospel that was written, the very first sentence in it says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And I mean, that feels very apolitical to me, right? Nothing in there about Democrats or Republicans. But within the context of the first century, this is perhaps one of the most politically charged statements that you could say. Why? Okay. So a couple of things. One is the Son of God bit. So you'll see over here, I've got a coin minted by Caesar Augustus. And on one side, it's got Caesar Augustus's head, and he's the Caesar when Jesus is born. And on the back, it says Deus Iuliu, which means divine Julius. Now, Julius Caesar is Caesar's adopted father. And so Julius Caesar Augustus Caesar takes on the title of Son of God. Right, so let that sink in for a moment. Julius Caesar, who's emperor of the whole known world, basically, is calling himself Son of God. And the Gospel of Mark says, hey, I'm also here to tell you about the real Son of God. So instantly, the Gospel of Mark is putting you in conflict with imperial propaganda. And then the other part that's blatantly political is that the Gospel of Mark calls itself a gospel, euangelon, the good news. Gospel is a technical term. It's a technical term in the way that the State of the Union is a technical term. I mean, you can say, hey, what's the State of the Union? But if you say this is a State of the Union, it refers to something within the political context. And so gospel or good news referred to an imperial decree. And so heralds would show up often after a battle or to announce some work project that an emperor was doing. And they say, we're here to announce the gospel, and here's the news that the emperor wants you to know. And so there's actually a temple in modern day Turkey that has an inscription dedicated to Caesar Augustus. And basically the inscription says, look, Providence really cares about all of us. And so it has brought us a savior who is going to end all war and bring about perfection to our society. He is our savior. His name is Caesar Augustus. And you'll see there at the very end of it, it says, the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good news for the world. Right, so literally the birth of Caesar is the beginning of the gospel. And then, of course, our gospels, 2 of them start with the birth of Jesus. So to the ancient world, these would be very explicit ways in which Jesus is being contrasted in opposition to Caesar, taking Caesar's titles and saying, Caesar isn't really the Son of God. Jesus is. Caesar doesn't have good news for you. Jesus does. It might be like saying, it is not our president who can speak to the state of the union. It is God who speaks to the state of our union. All right, so that's one of the ways in which the gospel is political. The next is the temple system. And in our minds, we might say, well, the temple in Jerusalem is a religious function, not a political function. But religion and politics in the ancient world were never separated. They always went hand in hand. And on the left, I have a passage from Leviticus that talks about what's called guilt offering. And basically, if you commit a sin or a trespass against someone, and then you go, oh, whoops, that was a sin, I shouldn't have done that. The first thing you have to do is go and repair what you have stolen or defrauded from your neighbor, along with a markup of 20% to repay whatever you've taken from them. But after you've hammered things out with the person you've sinned against, you also go and you make an offering to God in the temple. And the idea is people needed a way to know that they had been forgiven. And so in addition to tangibly restoring what was broken, what Lenny Duncan would call reparations to the person who had been sinned against, you also go to the temple and say, okay, within the eyes of God and the community, I've also been made right. And here it says, and you shall bring to the priest as your guilt offering to the Lord a ram without blemish. But it also has, like, if you have less money, you can offer smaller things, right? You can offer a bird if you don't have as much money. And the idea was always to say, your sin is absolved by you restoring what's wrong, what you have done wrong, and you atoning in your heart. But in order that you have a symbolic way to be reintegrated into the community, there is also this guilt offering made. And what Lenny Duncan will say is this system gets perverted. It gets perverted so that people are being told they have to offer sacrifices at the temple for them to have right relationship with God in a way that becomes exploitative, particularly to the poor who can't afford to do it. And so, Jesus very famously comes and he overturns the tables of the money changers, saying, like, look, this house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it into a den of robbers. To say, instead of this being a place where people are reconciled to God and restored as a community, this is a place where you are extorting people out of money. And so Christians have long seen Jesus's death on the cross as the final sacrifice that ends the sacrificial system completely. So Hebrews 10 here, saying, like, look, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law. And then Jesus added, see, I have come to do your will. He abolishes the first in order to establish the second. So Jesus abolishes the need for sacrificial offerings in order to do God's will. And ultimately, God's will is to reconcile humanity with God. And it is by God's will that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus once and for all. You can think about if someone came along and said, there is no longer going to be any debt allowed in our country. Like, no one can give or take loans, right? That would completely disrupt the economic system of our country. And that would be a huge threat, not just to our banks. Our whole political system would see that as an attack. And so Lenny Duncan is saying, when Jesus goes in and overchanges the changers in the temple, and when he critiques the temple system as a whole, he's threatening the economic viability of Jerusalem and all the elites and political figures who live off of it. So the third system that Lenny says Jesus disrupts is the patronage system. This is one I'm less convinced that Jesus disrupts, but let's explain why Lenny thinks it is disrupted. So the first thing you need to know is that particularly in the ancient Roman Republic, going back 6 centuries before Jesus, Rome was built on a system of reciprocal relationships called patrons and clients. And on your left here, you'll see in this red circle, there's a patron. And a patron would come from what was called the patrician class, which were the wealthy citizens of Rome. Patricians would have positions of privilege, like being judges or priests or senators. And the other folks are called plebeians. And plebeians didn't have the right to these official positions. They would have to do the hard labor of farming, basically. But Rome was sort of unique in that it said, okay, these plebeians can choose who they want in the patrician circles to take care of them. So plebeians could choose for themselves a patron of the patrician class. And what that patrician patron would do is essentially look out for the political and social and economic interests of the plebeians. So if a plebeian had trouble in court, their patrician patron would step in and say, okay, like, let me give you legal counsel. Let me be your legal representation. Like, I will literally stand before the jury and argue your case, or I'll explain to you the nuances of the Roman law. Or say a plebeian wanted to get married, but didn't have sufficient money for a dowry, or maybe especially if they wanted to sort of try to marry their way up in society. Well, then their patron would come along and provide the money for a dowry. Now, in exchange, plebeians basically offered their loyalty to their patrons. And that loyalty, could come about in a lot of ways. So if the patrician went to war, if the patron went to war, the plebeian would sort of show up as a soldier or an assistant in battle. If the patron was captured in battle, the plebeians or the clients would all pool together money to ransom their patron so he could be out of captivity. If their patron decided to run for office, it doesn't matter what the political inclinations of the plebeians were, they would vote for their patron, and they would show up at rallies for their patron. And the idea is the patron would just go to the plaza, the forum, the marketplace, and would be followed around by this entourage of clients. And it would be the way that the elite members of society showed their power and their influence, was how many clients they could have around them. Now, on your right, you'll see this system of patronage was not just like a one-to-one system. Patrons could themselves have patrons. And sometimes clients would have multiple patrons. And sometimes those patrons would have differing interests, and clients would have to try to figure out, how to navigate those tensions. Does that patronage system make sense to you? Basically, someone with a lot of education and a lot of wealth says, hey, I'm going to keep an eye on you in life. And in exchange, whenever I need your help, you show up and support me. and make me look good.
Is that where we get the word patronizing?
Yeah. So this is where all our idea of a patron of the arts, but also patronizing in the sense of, it's sort of talking down to someone. Now Jesus, instead of sort of developing a cohort of clients, which Jesus could easily do, right? Jesus has influence, he has status, he has power. He could gather a group of people around him and say, okay, now you're my clients. And clients were often expected to show up each morning at the gates of their patron's house to be like, hey, like, do you need me to do anything for you today? So Jesus could have done that, but he doesn't. And in fact, in John 15:15, he says to his disciples, who might easily have been seen as clients of Jesus, he says, I no longer call you slaves, because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. And he says, now you are my friends. I have told you everything the Father told me. And friendship in Roman society was perhaps the most valued relationship. Whereas patrons and clients, it's always understood that there's a power differential, that one has higher status over the other, but they still try to take care of each other. Friendship was understood to be a relationship of equals, and there was still a sense of mutual obligation and responsibility for each other, but not because one was better than the other, but because they liked each other and because their interests were aligned. And friendships were also often formalized. So nowadays we're like, oh, I know a guy on Facebook, he's my friend. But like, you would sort of publicly declare people your friends. I guess we do that on Facebook. Sort of publicly declare people your friends, and to break a friendship was sort of a profound transgression. So Jesus is saying, instead of practicing a relationship of patron and client, I want to have a relationship of friendship, where we're all in the same status. Does that make sense? And I think it's important to understand, this is like the client patron system was perhaps one of the defining features of Roman society for 600 years. So for Jesus to push against that is once again a profound assault on the political fabric of Roman society. I mean, just the fabric of society in general, in much the same way, Jesus frequently pushes against the nuclear family when he says, who are my mothers? Who is my mother? Who are my siblings? Whoever hears the word of God and does it. Right? He's pushing against one of the foundational building blocks of his society. All right. Now, you can see from this patronage system that if one person managed to get a lot of clients who themselves were influential people, you could have one patron rise above all the others. And there are some historians who really see the rise of the Caesars as the ultimate expression of the patronage system. For about 600 years, Rome functioned as a republic. And then starting with Julius, but really solidified with Augustus Caesar in the 1st century, you get these emperors who just have unchecked power within Roman society. And it's like, how does that happen? Well, if one person can essentially make every other person of influence their client, not through necessarily violence, but just managing to work those social networks, they can accrue incredible influence. And then once the Caesars get to that position of power, suddenly it's in their interest not to have anyone else be a patron. And so there's a dramatic shift in the patronage system once Rome shifts from a republic to an empire, because Caesar doesn't want some governor in Judea having lots of his personal clients. Caesar wants everyone to be his client and only his client, which is how you end up with sort of a hierarchy with one person at the top. And Lenny Duncan wants to say, Jesus rejects this patronage model, and we need to think about how we as a church participate in a patronage model. And so there's sort of two main ways in which churches organize themselves. One is an episcopal model and one is a congregational model. And I'll ask you after I explain the two, which one our denomination is. So the episcopal model says, all right, all power and authority comes from God, and it goes through a pope, or if you don't have a pope, maybe a presiding bishop, down to other bishops, and then to your clergy, and then from the clergy to the people and the laity. And often when churches are built on this model, the money follows the power. So in the Catholic Church, right, it's not the congregation that pays the priests. It's the bishops who pay the priests. And so the priest's loyalty at the end of the day is to their bishops, because it's the bishops who have power over them, who decide what happens in their life. Now, another model is what's called the congregational model. And the congregational model says, all right, all power and authority comes from God, and it flows through God's people as a collective whole. And those people choose members of a board or a council to govern, and then that board or council directs a pastor. And so in that instance, the pastor, right, their loyalty is first and foremost to the congregation, the people of the congregation, because they're not paid by bishops. Those pastors are paid by the people in the pews. And so they have to keep the people in the pews happy, whereas the priests in the episcopal model have to keep the bishops happy. Okay, so which one does Faith Lutheran function as? I think people are muted.
Congregational.
That's right. So the Lutheran Church functions under a congregational model. The benefit of this is that you don't have to deal with corrupt bishops shifting around pastors that you don't like. You can be, I don't like this pastor. He's not doing his job. He's abusing people. We're going to get rid of him. What Lenny Duncan points out is suddenly your pastor, if your pastor wants to get a paycheck, has to keep the people in the pews happy. And Upton Sinclair has this lovely quote that says, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." And Lenny Duncan points out, he's like, look, if your pastor is set up to always be worrying about his salary, always be worrying if the people who give him money are going to stop giving him money, it's going to be really hard for your pastor to say hard things to the people in the pews. That said, I don't know if there is a church that's come up with a brilliant solution to avoid the fact that, pastor has to answer to somebody. There are denominations in which pastors work other jobs and gain their income from that, and so are perhaps less financially dependent on the whims and on pleasing their congregation. So, I'm curious. I'm curious, how often have you attended churches where your pastor agrees with your politics? And how often have you attended churches where your pastor does not agree with your politics?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Where does the synod and the bishop play in the congregational model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, between the board and the pastor, is where the synod would sit in this model. And essentially the synod's main job is to say to the board, here are the people from which you can choose to be a pastor. And, basically by saying, we have trained these people. We know that they're up to their stuff on the Bible and on theology, and they know theoretically how to have good boundaries and provide pastoral care. So yeah, they sort of function in between the board and the pastor in helping the board choose the pastor. And then if the board has a problem with the pastor, but doesn't want to just go straight ahead with firing the pastor, theoretically the board can try to enlist the help of the synod to mediate that relationship.
The synod also can decide that you don't call the correct pastor. Our synod dealt with this way back when the two congregations in San Francisco called gay pastors. And the synod said, okay, you can call those gay pastors, you are no longer part of our synod. And as it turned out, the district in San Francisco, they were always invited. The first thing at a synod council, synod conference here, the first order on business is that we gave them full rights to be there and everything. So we just sort of ignored the main church. But that, we're sort of like a hybrid. You can make arguments that we're also an Episcopal model also. If you select which facts you want to point out, the same way you can point that we're congregational just by selecting which facts you want to point out.
So yeah, I would say, right, we have people who are called bishops. They have very little real power. And certainly what you mentioned about the synod being able to say, you can't call that person as a pastor, is what I was trying to explain by the synod sitting between the board and the pastor, in that it's the synod that tells the board, hey, these are the people you can choose from to be your pastor. And in that instance, the synod said, no, you don't get to choose, these pastors who happen to be gay. Yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah,
the question answer.
Yeah, no, but for instance, also in the Episcopal model, priests have to get permission from their bishops to change the scripture readings on a Sunday. This is true both in the Catholic Church and in the Episcopal Church. It's not true for me. I can pick whatever scripture I want. And often bishops will actually send priests sermons that they have to read if the bishop wants a particular thing to get emphasized. So to say there really are stark differences, but perhaps the most important one is who pays the pastor. Because at the end of the day, right, whoever pays the piper picks the tune. So there is that challenge. But this goes to my question then of how often have you attended a church where the pastor agrees or disagrees with your politics?
Probably 100%. If I insist that my pastor agrees with everything I ever said or ever thought politically.
100% what?
That I have never attended a church where pastors agreed with me 100%.
All right, but predominantly?
I don't know if I consider that a complete issue.
Okay.
Only because you make excuses. If it was really far out, I would probably look at gospel reasons why he's wrong and I'm right, which may or not be the truth. But you got to justify yourself, right? That you're making the right decision.
Of course. How about other folks?
So I'll have to chime in because I belonged to a church during the 2009 decision. And if I remember correctly, the ELCA bishop said, no one overreact. Everybody just sort of take a breath. We're just announcing this. And I had a pastor that came out of the chute saying that if we're going to have gay pastors, we should no longer be part of the ELCA. We should leave.
Sure.
I immediately went to my synod bishop and said, this is absolutely juxtaposed to what you guys guided them to do, is to do nothing. They came back, they talked to him. He came back the next week and said, I overreacted. And he ended up pissing off both sides. The conservative people were really happy the first week, and the liberal people almost walked out of the church. And the next week, he pissed off the conservative people, and they were about to walk out of the church. And I think when people go that, I think, especially Americans, saying separation of church and state is a cop-out for churches to say, well, we're not political, we have to stay out of it. But when there's subjects that are against human rights and against other people, we need leaders. We don't need people to just do what their congregation says. We need leaders that say, no, this is against the gospels of Christ.
Yeah.
We need to stand up. And then if you lose part of your congregation, you lose part of your congregation. That's life. But I have been in that church, and I watched that church, go through a schism for the next, 5 years, because he obliterated both sides of the aisle. And they now are leaning back into their comfortable conservative mode again. But I really think that we lose our way is when we don't have leaders. We have pastors that we treat as employees as opposed to someone that's supposed to lead.
And that's exactly what Lenny says of, as a denomination, we have to stop treating pastors as employees.
And we say that you're called by God.
Sure.
And do we always act like we think our pastor is called by God, and rather than being called by us? And I'm not saying any church I belong to, this didn't, but there's been churches that have, most of their budget comes from 2 or 3 people.
Yeah.
And the pastor, in their mind, is their employee.
Yeah, and you can see, right, with that patronage system of if there's 1 or 2 people who pay the pastor's salary, is the pastor going to speak out against the opinions of those 2 people? Seems unlikely if the pastor wants to keep the pastor's job. Yeah.
He can put in for another call.
Yes, yeah, and many pastors do. Yeah. But, once again, if a pastor has a family, what that means is uprooting your family. And indeed, once again, right, the Catholic Church's model of the priests obey the bishop and the priests are celibate, in many ways is designed to allow priests to be able to speak what they feel they need to speak, so that, yeah, they can anger the members in their pews, and they can go where they're needed rather than, where their family has put down roots. All right, but so to say, yeah, just to be mindful of how the systems we set up are going to influence the results that we get. All right. So, one of the things Lenny Duncan says is we have to refuse to allow toxic behavior in churches to prevent the work of Jesus. And part of that is saying, exactly as Greg said, we can't allow tithing to determine the decisions we make as a congregation, right? We can't say, well, I don't want to upset someone who might give us a lot of money. We have to be willing to stick with the gospel. And sometimes that means, yeah, there's less money in the plate. And part of it means not allowing bullies to go unchallenged out of a sense of politeness. I know so many churches where there's a handful of people who treat everyone terribly, and no one wants to be treated that way. And so no one stands up to them for fear of getting, being in their wrath. And I've seen how that can destroy churches. And so it means, in the same way that not afraid to tell someone, at the end of the day, I don't care how much money you give. Like Jesus calls us to do this, saying, look, at the end of the day, I don't care how mad it'll make you. You can't treat people that way. And so some other just systemic examples are to say, hey, right, instead of talking about people behind their back, talking to people to their faces. One of the things a few years back that this congregation focused a lot on before I arrived was to not have parking lot conversations when conversations should be happening in committees. It's very easy in a committee to have people you disagree with and you don't want to enter into that conflict. And so you just don't say anything and you wait till you're in the parking lot with your friends and then you badmouth people, right? But this actually creates a toxic system rather than a system that produces justice or the kingdom of God. And so having instead direct, honest, and loving conversations. All right. So Lenny Duncan sets all this up to say that we need to be a part of expanding God's tent. And what does that look like? So he's got this beautiful chapter where he says, or this beautiful paragraph where he says, you don't have to be at every march, every event, every protest, ranting and raving on social media. You can do this very real and important community organizing in your own sanctuaries. You can use the blueprint laid out by the greatest community organizer in human history, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. By cleaning up our side of the street, our own communities, by quietly creating faith-filled launch sites for change, we are better preparing the saints to walk in accompaniment and to create the great revelation, the unveiling of God's glorious eschaton on earth. Eschaton is a fancy Greek word that means that final vision that God has. All right, so when he says, you don't have to be at every march, who's he talking to? He's talking to you. He's talking to you about doing this work in your own congregations. He says explicitly, you don't have to be called or ordained to do this, right? You don't have to wear a collar to do the work of expanding God's tent. And as Lutherans, this is fundamental to our system of belief, which is that we believe in a priesthood of all believers, that every single person who calls on the name of Christ is a priest and has the priest's mission to proclaim God's word and bring forth the kingdom of God. 1 Peter 2:9 says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you might proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. All right. And then Lenny goes on to say, look, someone at your church is much more likely to listen, to you than to me. They love you, receive the sacraments with you, confess and seek forgiveness with you. They are everything you are, and together you are so much more. You can work for change in them and with them precisely because you are already bonded to them in love. One of the great gifts that congregational life gives us is the fact that we develop deep relationships with people over time that transcend a single issue. And because we develop relationships with people over everything from sharing donuts at coffee hour to working on building houses to, praying with each other in our moments of grief, that builds bonds of strength which allow us much more effectively to talk to people about challenging issues like racism. And Lenny reminds us, he says, dear church, truth that is not grounded in love is just brutality. So now I have some questions for you, which is to say, how do you have hard conversations with people you love? Let's start with that one. For the people in your life, be they maybe a spouse or a child, a family member, a friend, when you know like someone has done something wrong in your life, how do you go about talking to them about that?
What's interesting for me is that I found that it's easier for me to have that hard conversation with somebody if what they've done wrong or who they wronged is not myself. I have a hard time having that conversation if it's something that actually happened to me. I tend to avoid those conversations and try to act like it didn't happen. But it's easier for me to have that conversation with my kids or whoever if it's about somebody else.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I guess I just worry that I'll push them away or I'm seeing it wrong. I'm not sure. Something that I try to work on. Yeah. I feel like I've gotten better at it as I get older, but.
Well, let me ask you then, when you see, you know, a wrong against someone else, say one of your kids has injured their siblings, how do you approach that person?
With the conversation, we talk about, you know, what was said, and you know, how would you feel if this was said to you, or you know, similar situation, and just try to talk it through and look at all sides of it, and you know, how could this have been handled better?
Out of curiosity, when you see the slight happening or the injury happening, do you in that moment jump in and have the conversation, or do you tend to wait for an opportune time?
I think it depends. I think I tend to jump in, but sometimes I realize it might not have been the best choice to jump in at that moment in time. You know, I guess it depends on what's happening, but sometimes it probably would be better if I just took a step back and talked to that person, you know, later, maybe in private instead of jumping in right in the middle.
Okay. Thank you. How about other folks? How do you have those conversations with people? What do you do to prepare the groundwork?
I don't know if I'm talking about something not necessarily a personal issue, but you're taught. I think it's important also, we say how we're going to talk to somebody. Mm-hmm. I think it maybe is even more important how we're going to listen to them. And I mean, if we want them to show love, I guess we have to show love to them also by listening to them. And quite often, if you're just talking about an issue of some kind, or even about behavior, quite often the argument is over vocabulary. Mm-hmm. It isn't even over the main issue. Might be the kernel of the issue you might even agree on, but you're using different words that are triggering different ideas in different people. Now, when I'm hot, do I listen? No. But when you listen, it's probably more important listening than talking to people about ideas and what they feel like. And let's say we're talking about a radical issue of, you know, we're going to do something. And let's say I'm liberal, so I'm talking to someone conservative. This conservative person may be worried about something that would be an unintended consequence if I got everything my way. But there's a way to honor there's a way to prevent that unintended consequence if you think about it.
Yeah, I think that's profound wisdom, is to say anytime we want to enter into a hard conversation with someone, to be willing to listen to what it is that they're feeling and experiencing.
And you have to accept that they may not agree with you.
Yeah. Yep, you don't always change everyone's mind. Yeah. I saw Penny unmute herself briefly. Penny, did you have something you want to say?
No, not at all. I've got too many computers going on right now.
Okay, sounds good. I was going to see if Annalisa might share how she talks to me when she's mad at me about something I've done. Huh?
It's funny. Nothing comes to mind about you.
Oh,
dear,
really?
in
Okay.
specific, but I've been over here. I've been thinking about when I've worked with students who are escalated, and maybe there's been an incident like destruction of a classroom or something, or physically hurting a staff member. And I agree with Darlene. I think the second that my debriefing session turns into like what they did and what they need to do differently, and it becomes preachy, you can just see them shut down even more, like pretty instantly. And so starting from a place of how are you doing, what was happening for you, and how can I help, it's much more effective at, if I ask them, what do you need and how can I help you, it's more effective at getting to restorative justice. Right, well, now we need to clean up the classroom, or we need to write an apology note, or to repair that relationship. And trying to talk to them when they're heated is not effective. So waiting 20 or 30 minutes is much more successful.
Thank you. Yeah. Practical tips. All right, well then let me ask one of the other questions. So this next one is one at the back of the book for the chapter. It says, in what ways do you need to stretch God's tent to make room for more people in your community of faith?
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, Franklin.
For me, I'd like to answer this. There's many ways to answer this, but for my continuing growing in my life and learning and going through difficulties in my life and understanding how they shape me, and then in a very practical way, learning how to shape myself through how I see God in my life, but also in being able to make amends or to say when I'm wrong. That offers this big width for something to happen, it seems. While I'm asking for forgiveness, sometimes I don't always get that, but I do grow in the process, and I offer and receive a gift in that as well. But general growth, looking for where I can learn and continuing to seek that for myself opens up a story in me, so that when I see other people that might have stories that like mine, or I can share in a story, I open the tent in that kind of way. That idea that my story, I'm not supposed to sit in a shame of it or a guilt of it, and that aspect of that it's there for me to share what God has done in my life, and to be open for maybe even others that where they feel like God hasn't been in their life, or how God has hurt them in their life, and being able to listen to that opens the tent even more. And when I continue to find places, even school, where I have a very difficult time, and I open the tent for relationships through other people. And I guess that's how one way I could answer that question.
So that sounds like really a personal sense of expanding the tent within your own heart.
And that's how I see each of us in opening the tent for the church, is that each of us, when we are approaching our own lives in that kind of way, we open that in that invitation. Maybe I'm misunderstanding after reading the chapter and looking at the question, but that's how I see it. So me and my personal level opens up for the width of the tent, and that in each of our walks, we open that tent up. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think, the question I was trying to get at more was like, as Faith Lutheran Church, are there folks that we aren't welcoming in? But I love your responses to say, look, this is the way that I can do a better job of that. Because that gets us to the very next question, which is, Lenny says, not just Lenny, Martin Luther says, not just Martin Luther, like the Bible says, each one of us is a priest and are ordained to do the work of expanding God's tent. And so the question is, do you actually believe that? Do you believe that you have both the responsibility and the power to do it? And Franklin, it sounds like you do. That's wonderful. How about other folks?
I'd like to say that Darlene Holman opened up the tent for me as an 8th grader when we had a discussion about death, and I was able to reconcile how scared I was in death, and it opened me up for my relationship now and walk with Christ. So I know Darlene Holman opened up the tent.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Franklin. Yep, exercising her priesthood there and raising up the next generation in faith. Yeah.
Well, it's better than him remembering me for teaching him that you could write in your Bible.
That's important too.
I should still do that.
Well, anyone else? What do you think? Do you feel like, oh yeah, I am actually one of God's servants on a mission? You can just nod or shake your head.
There's a lot of people here that have been my priests. There's like this room in one way or another, and specifically at church, you have. So if we're not talking about it, that's okay, but you have for me.
I was going to say, I feel like much in the same way you were all very quiet when I asked if you love the church and how you express that love. The people who are here are folks who are very clearly ministering in God's name each and every day. So thank you for doing it. I hope you feel like you're doing it. We are working to make sure you do feel like you are part of God's priesthood. All right, we'll go on to the next chapter. All right, so the question, this whole chapter is the gospel as a revolutionary text. And I'm curious, when someone says, I'm calling you to a revolution, what are the images that come to your mind? What do you imagine that to look like? I think of Molotov cocktails.
Upheaval.
Destruction.
Destruction, yeah.
And I want to say no. When I think of revolution, I think of heading towards anarchy, where you want to eliminate everything. And history tells me that when you get rid of the higher ups. You just bring in new higher ups by different names. I'd almost like to think of us as we're constantly a Reformation church.
Yeah.
That we keep reforming, we keep looking to see, oh dear, this is not going right. Go back to the gospel. And I think that's what Jesus did too. Because a lot of what he said was not new.
Sure.
A lot of what he said we can find in the Old Testament.
100%.
So God was telling them all along, this is what I mean.
Yep.
And so, and they were understanding half of it and ignoring half of it and going, kept going the wrong direction. So I think I like the word reformation rather than revolution.
And certainly, I found this chapter funny because the first few pages are this very fiery rhetoric of revolution. And then he's like, all right, and this is what it looks like. And then,
And there's peace, right?
yeah, exactly. Of course, he talks about Jesus. And, there's all sorts of things that Jesus does, but he points out Jesus spends time with the marginalized and the outcast. And so I've included some Bible references for the things that Lenny mentions. Jesus acknowledges. He says, look, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Say Jesus is spending time with folks who are on the margins of society. Lenny Duncan describes Jesus as an itinerant preacher rooted in a sense of community. And so in Matthew 10, when Jesus sends out his disciples to the villages in Israel, he says to them, take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or staff, for laborers to serve their food. And whatever town or village you enter, find out in it who is worthy and stay there until you leave. As you enter a house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your presence come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And so there's this sense that the disciples are going to be wandering from town to town, but when they enter a town, they pick a family and then they commit to that family. They don't say, well, actually the neighbor down the road has a lot nicer house, or they agree with me more, or they don't snore as much. The idea is, yes, they're traveling from place to place, but when they come to each place, they commit to that place and invest deeply in it. And he says, look, it's Jesus's relationship with the people that he served and their faith in the power of God that is what allowed Jesus to accomplish his deeds of power. And so this reminder that the true power and transformation comes from faith and from relationships. And so I list here the centurion saying to Jesus, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word and my servant will be healed. And then he says, look, Jesus is all about having deep relationships with people. And in the midst of those deep relationships, he speaks hard and sometimes divisive truths. And so I list here the interaction that Jesus has with the rich young man who says, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus says, what are the commandments? And the rich young man lists the commandments and says, I've done them. And Jesus responds by looking at him. And the gospel says that Jesus loved him and said, you are lacking one thing. Go sell what you own and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me. And so in that moment, we see that combination of deep love that Jesus has for this young man, and also the hard truth that he's willing to say to him. And the young man will, in that moment, not follow Jesus. And so Jesus does lose a follower in that moment. But Jesus loses the follower because he loves the young man enough to be honest with him about what he lacks. And I didn't put it in here because you sort of need more of the story, but I also think the story of Jesus's relationship with Peter is a profound one, where, right, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And at the end of the Gospel of John, when Peter sees the resurrected Jesus, Jesus says to him 3 times, "Do you love me? And if so, go feed my sheep." And there's the sense, right, where Jesus is both affirming the love they have in that relationship, but also forcing Peter to admit 3 times the way that he denied Jesus 3 times. And it, yeah, that passage always strikes me as the type of conversation you can only have with someone who you have loved deeply and who you've hurt deeply, and that those 2 things don't cancel each other out. All right. So Lenny Duncan goes on to say, Jesus was divisive. And he doesn't quote a scriptural passage, but I will. We actually heard this a couple weeks ago. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." Not a literal sword, but a word that divides. And he talks about how families will be divided. And he says, "Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." And to say, yeah, Jesus is very clear. While he may offer love to everyone, he understands that not everyone will be happy with what he says, and that people will go their separate ways because of it. Lenny Duncan, after saying Jesus was divisive, he kind of gets a little more poetic about it. And he says, look, we don't divide just to tick people off. He says, our purpose in dividing is not dividing one person from another person, although that may be a consequence. This says, our purpose in dividing is dividing what is life-giving from what is empire, right? That sense of what is the peace that surpasses all understanding from the Pax Romana, which is really just killing everyone so that they can't fight each other. And he said, we got to divide what is God from what is not God. There are so many things in this world that try to claim to be God and demand our loyalty. And our job is to say, nope, that's not God. And to divide what is love from hate. Sometimes it feels like that should be obvious. And yet one of the most profound challenges in this world is, in fact, how do you have conflict with people? Often conflict that is motivated out of a desire to love others. But how easily that desire to love others and that leading us in disagreement with others can actually cause us to hate. So sometimes we've got to divide things. And then Lenny Duncan goes on to talk about how Jesus was killed by the police. Actually, a good chunk of my Good Friday sermon was about this very subject. When I was smashing the mirror, I don't know if you noticed. But so, right, explicitly John 18:12, so soldiers, their officers, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. So Jesus is literally arrested by police and then killed by soldiers.
But they were egged on by the citizens. I thought he was giving the ordinary people a free ride there.
Yeah, so this is, and this is also what I said in my Good Friday sermon of, right, the police just do what we pay them to do. Right. At the end of the day, the police are an expression of our society. And while, yes, I think there's a need for greater police accountability, there's also a need for us to recognize the police are carrying out the values and the laws that we have told them to carry out. Yeah. It's also interesting, sort of in recent times, there's been a lot of conversation about Judas Iscariot. And a colleague of mine noted that Iscariot literally means from Kerioth. And there are two Kerioths in the scriptures. One is across the Dead Sea from Israel in what was in ancient times called Moab. And then another Kerioth is in Judea. And Judas Iscariot, right? Iscariot literally means the man from Kerioth. It's likely that he is from this town in Judea. And what's fascinating about that is it means Judas is the only person of the 12 disciples who's from Judea. The other disciples come from the north, from Galilee, the region to the north. And Galilee was culturally very different from Judea, right? Judea was the urban center, the capital. It was the place of power. Galilee is the backwater north state. Right, the parallels there are pretty clear. But to say, often people who have interacted with positions of power, who've grown up moving through those circles, feel a lot more comfortable and trusting towards them than folks who've grown up on the margins of society. So, right, as a young man, my godfather is a police officer. In middle school, I went to a police summer camp. Actually, I went to multiple police summer camps. I have a very positive sense of my relationship with the police. People of color have had very different experiences with the police. And so I am much more likely to ask a police officer for help. I am much less likely to think it might be a bad idea to call the police in a stressful situation. In the same way, Judas has been hanging around with the temple, hanging around the police in Judea, right? When it says the Jewish police, they don't mean Jewish as in the worshiping the God of Israel. They mean the police of Judea. And so there are some folks who said maybe Judas was like, well, this Jesus is causing a lot of problems. Maybe I just need to call the cops so that he'll calm down, so that he stops making such a ruckus. And I have actually noticed that when you read the Gospels, never does it say Judas wanted to kill Jesus. What it says here in Matthew is that he goes to the chief priests and says, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. So there's, right, the sense that Judas is just like, hey, I know he's causing problems for you. What can I get out of it if you arrest him? And it's only after that arrest goes from, all right, Jesus, you need to take it down, to now we're going to kill you, Jesus. When Judas realizes that when he called in the police, they didn't just pacify the situation. They killed the man he called the cops on. Suddenly, Judas repents to the point of not only returning the money, but killing himself. And I think it's helpful for us to be mindful of the ways in which we may have much more comfortable relationships with institutions of power, and may assume that they treat others the way that we have been treated by them. Because sometimes those assumptions can have deadly consequences, as we have seen time and time again when white folks call the cops on people of color. All right. Jesus never asked for copay. So this is Lenny Duncan advocating universal healthcare. And I give a Bible verse where indeed Jesus says, cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons, you receive without payment, give without payment. And so Lenny Duncan says, you know what, be a part of providing healthcare in your community. Go and visit the health clinics, volunteer at the health clinics. Lenny Duncan advocates for a needle, being part of a needle exchange, which has become a very controversial topic in our community today. I couldn't think of an instance where Jesus participates in a needle exchange, mostly because a needle exchange is built on the model of harm reduction, and Jesus can just heal people instantly. Yeah. And so there's, right, he doesn't have to like taper people down. So we don't see that in there. But that idea of providing healthcare with no barriers, I think, is what Lenny's getting to with the needle exchange. All right, and then once more, Lenny wants to get us to this idea that Jesus is political. But Lenny says, look, dear church, step away from partisan bickering and hold our leaders to account. Your faith, not your political party, motivates you. And so I'm going to give you some examples of Jesus's nonviolent protesting and compare them with modern day nonviolent protesting. But then I'm going to ask you how you think we as a congregation can be political without being partisan. All right, so Jesus, on Palm Sunday, the crowds fill the streets and they throw their cloaks and they throw branches in the street, and Jesus rides along on a donkey. And in fact, the Pharisees say to Jesus, tell your disciples to be quiet, otherwise, you're going to get in huge trouble. And Jesus says, if they were quiet, even the stones would shout out. And I compare that here to when protesters shut down streets. I have been a part of this thing, the same thing with the Manhattan Bridge, of literally you just go stand in the middle of the street and it shuts down all traffic. And the people in the cars really don't like it. I would not like it if I were in one of those cars. And the point is not to gather sympathy from those drivers. The point is to say, this is such a crisis that everything else needs to stop until we address it. Jesus, as we already discussed, goes into the temple and knocks over the tables of the moneylenders. So I'll compare that to Occupy Wall Street. Folks who do sit-ins, who literally go into businesses or places of power and say, hey, we're going to disrupt business here until you address our concerns. And then Jesus goes into the temple, and he, after he's chased out the moneylenders, he starts preaching and teaching. And people come and they try to debate him, but he continues to astound them. And I compare that. This is actually a photo not from the United States, but from the Ukraine in 2015. When Russia was invading and there was violence, the priests in the Ukraine would sort of go and physically place themselves between police and protesters, so that the police and security forces wouldn't kill or grievously harm the protesters. And then they would minister, and they ministered to anyone, to police and protesters alike. And Lenny Duncan, one of the things he suggests is, he says, go to your legislature and start singing hymns and praying. He says nothing throws a politician like a bunch of people singing hymns. They don't know what to do with that. And in fact, our synod, one day a year, has a Lutheran Advocacy Day, where Lutherans are invited to gather in the state capitol en masse, and they're given some talking points that are set at our synod assembly, and they basically, Lutherans say, hey, we care about this issue, Mr. or Mrs. Politician, what are you going to do about it? That didn't happen this year because of COVID, but maybe it'll happen next year. Last year, Mason Massa went. Massas, or Greg or Raquel, did Mason tell you anything about that? Maybe they're not there.
Hello,
hey,
people.
Mason, there he is.
Hi, it's the man, the myth, the legend.
Nice.
Wait, what are we talking about?
So talking about Lutheran advocacy, and when you went down to the state capitol,
Oh, that was fun.
the church, what did you do when you went down to the state capitol?
We went down there and then we got a service, a church service. And then after that, we went over and we talked about what our main talking points were going to be in all of the meetings and stuff. And then we talked about it in a group. And then we went over to the Capitol and we hung out a teensy bit. And then we went into the meetings with all the Congress people and stuff and just talked about what the points we wanted to talk about were. So yeah, it was pretty fun.
Nice. Do you remember what the points you talked about were?
I think it was child poverty, clean water, equal clean water access, and immigration, I think.
Nice.
Yeah.
Sound like great issues. Let me ask, how did the politicians respond when you all showed up?
Some of the politicians weren't there, but yeah, they had like really nice office. They were like really nice. Their staff was really nice. Some of the politicians themselves were nice.
Sure.
Yeah. It was, even the ones that you would think weren't going to be nice or something, they were actually like really nice and stuff.
All
They were
right.
all very nice and open about what we wanted to talk about.
So, so Mason, if if the pandemic is better next year and there's another opportunity to do it, would you recommend that we go?
Yeah, it was a really fun time.
All right. Well, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yep. You're welcome.
All right. Look at that. Our church in action, led by the youngest among us. So let me ask you all. I told you this would be a question. How do you think we can be political in the sense of addressing societal needs on a political level without being partisan?
There's lots of subjects that are political in nature, but this, if you're political based on a set of values that aren't partisan, for example, most people probably agree that poverty is bad. It's just, how do we all want the same thing, a reduction in poverty. How do we get there?
Right.
So, if you're going in with, from that standpoint, that seems to be.
Yeah. So stating what are our values first and foremost.
Yeah.
And then saying, look, our goal is to live out these values. We don't care what party or politician is going to do that. We just want it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great way. How about other folks?
Well, things become political that you didn't even think were political. Years ago, Faith sponsored, I don't know if anybody remembers, back when the Vietnam boat people,
Yeah.
we sponsored a family
Yep.
and gave them shelter here in Chico. And I mean, that I didn't think, and I don't know if anybody else in our congregation thought we were doing anything political. And all of a sudden, in the community, we got some blowback from that.
Back in the 70s.
I don't know, way back.
But when you got the blowback, was it back decades ago?
It had to be probably 70s, 80s that we did that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it is amazing. You're like, oh, why are people upset about that? Yeah. Yep.
In today's world, who would have thought wearing a mask is political?
Yeah, true.
It is mind-boggling. Yeah. Yep.
I'm wondering if it might be helpful for us to have more conversation about what it means to be partisan.
Yeah, that's a great.
I think that we think, we think we know where other people are in terms of their political stance. And maybe it would be helpful for us to talk about what is it that is creating that divide, and can we find some new ways to attend to that?
Yep.
I mean, right now we're involved in this investigation of having an asylee and sponsoring an asylee or a family here in Chico, and we've had good response, but we're still in the process of making that happen. That could well be something that could create some blowback, as Darlene has mentioned. But I haven't felt that, but I think that certainly could be a possibility.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it is something where I feel like that was an instance in which immigration is such a politically charged issue right now, and the congregation had public conversation about it, and then tried to figure out, okay, what are the core values that we have around this issue, and realizing that welcoming the stranger is a core value that we have, and finding out, okay, how can we live that out? Because I think, right, in a climate where certain political leaders are trying to prevent refugees from coming to the United States, saying we want to host a refugee becomes a political act. But I don't think it has to be a partisan act, right? We're not signing up with a political party, or there's no candidate who's coming to help us do this. We're living out our values. Yeah.
I just read an interesting article today. I think the United Nations is working on it, and it's been an organization that has provided information about the growth of the world population, and that initially they indicated that somewhere around 2100 we would reach the maximum number of people that would be born, and then it would start to diminish. But as they look at the records that are being given now, it looks like it's going to be happening somewhere in the late part of this century. And one of the things that they brought up, which was very interesting to me, is that countries that are open to immigration will do much better than those who are closed to immigration. And I thought that was just a real fascinating piece of information, particularly as we look at where we are today, which seems to be a real partisan issue. And yet this, this study that's going on is indicating that there's some other potential positive things in regards to immigration that we need to pay attention to.
I think your point on we make assumptions about people's political stances and party allegiances is really important. When we were having the conversation around immigration, I talked to a lot of Republicans both in our congregation and in our community, and I was struck by how many Republicans in our congregation said, actually, we would love to have more immigrants. We're all for it. And the ways in which so often, right, the fact that we have two political parties tries to force people to pick one and then agree with all the stances of that party or all the stances of the other party in ways that are unnatural. Yeah. And I think being able to say what are our actual values rather than what's our party is a very important distinction.
Well, we know in our country we can't survive without people who are coming from this, Central America and Mexico and those areas to survive. I mean, we depend on that.
Yep.
And a lot of that has to do with farm work.
Yep. And our farmers around here know it very well.
Yep. Yeah.
All right. Pastor Duncan is wrapping up here. So in addition to, things like advocating, being a part of advocating for police reform and accountability, in addition to advocating and being a part of providing healthcare, Langdon Duncan also says, look, it's also important that we teach in the way that Jesus does, because part of the revolutionary acts that Jesus does is give information to people, help people understand where their shackles come from and the ways in which they're shackling themselves. And so Lenny encourages us to teach about oppressive theologies and to provide alternatives, to teach about institutional racism and the ways that that appears in our own institutions, to teach about the causes of poverty. He says specifically to name, to talk about LGBTQ suicide rates, that the average lifespan for a Black trans woman is 35 years. So yeah, the importance of education and the church being a place of education. And he says, look, Jesus was also a preacher. This is one of the revolutionary things that Jesus does. He preaches, and this perhaps is my favorite line in the whole book. He says, and that may require sermons that last more than 15 minutes.
That was not a good idea.
That's right. That's right. You can barely get into the meat of Scripture and our sin and what the gospel has to offer us in 15 minutes.
There's got to be a verse in Leviticus that says it has to be 15 minutes.
Nope. And he says, look, not every sermon needs to be challenging, but he says some of them need to be challenging. You can't dodge them. You can't constantly be dodging these sermons. You gotta have some that are challenging. And then he kind of does a recap, and he says, look, okay, just like we talked about with, just like we talked about with repentance and reconciliation, the need for reparations, that it's not enough to say Black Lives Matter, but we need to repay the debts to Black and brown bodies, that we need to acknowledge and dismantle colonialist ideology and practices, that's both within the church and within our society, to acknowledge and dismantle the patriarchy and the ways in which sexism deforms people of every gender. He says we need to acknowledge and dismantle the worship of money. And we've talked about the many ways in which, money shapes the ways in which our congregation and our denominations values people and is willing to take risks or not take risks. And he says we need to stop counting butts in pews and start counting on changing lives. Right? At the end of the day, the church is growing not if you've got a lot of people sitting. The church is growing if there are a lot of people having their lives transformed by Jesus. And that's what's going to sustain the church, is having those transformations.
Does that mean you're going to start doing altar calls?
Maybe I should start doing some altar calls. Yeah. I think in reality, what it means is being more intentional about mentorship and maybe small groups, and making sure that we're building relationships, not just between me as the pastor and individuals, but between siblings in faith, so that they can help each other on a more intimate level through their walk. He says, look, we got to reject the narrative of decline. If we believe that the church is a sinking ship and anything we do to rock the boat is just going to make it sink faster, we're going to be paralyzed. And so he says, instead of thinking that the church is in decline, may we see the church in this moment as being refined in the same way that ore from the earth is put into the fire so that its impurities can be melted away, and what is left is stronger and more resilient. So too the church is in this moment, having the parts of it that aren't necessary and are in fact perhaps a distraction, they're being removed. And so he says, look, this is the greatest time to be a Christian in 500 years. And he says, yeah, there's a lot of things that we're losing as the church, right? We may not have the budgets we used to have. We may not have the packed youth groups we used to have. But he's saying, look, the things we're leaving behind, those are just the burial wrappings that Jesus left behind on the day of his resurrection. To say the things we used to wrap the church in, those weren't the church. And for us to be the church, we may need to leave them behind. And so my question for you is, do you agree with Lenny Duncan that this is the best time to be a Christian in the past 500 years?
Yes.
Yeah.
Bill Key says yes. Why? Why, Bill?
Well, I've been reading things over the last number of years that, we're entering into this new 500-year time frame. And I kept asking myself, what is it that's going to happen? Was it 9/11? Was it an African-American president? And then we have this virus that comes along. And this has nothing to do with anybody. And maybe that's the shift that's going to happen for us in terms of taking, how is it that we relate to the whole world in a way that values everyone? So, maybe this is while it's terrible, and our reaction to it, our resistance to it, is really a gift that's coming to us that we had not planned on. And it's going to shift who we might be in the days and the years and decades and centuries to come over the next 500 years.
Interesting. Do you see that as unique to being a Christian?
I see it as unique in terms of who we are as part of God's creation.
Gotcha.
So I think it's broader if you want to limit it to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But I think that Jesus is much bigger than who we are as a Christian church.
Fair enough.
So maybe we could kind of shift how it is we understand how Jesus is present in the world. I don't think Jesus is. Well, I don't know. It's kind of like this coming text. Who's the planter of the weeds? So.
Well, thank you, Bill. Let me ask other folks. What do you think? Are you excited to be a Christian right now? Or are you like, oh, it's a terrible time to be a Christian?
I am. I see a lot of hope, even as bad as things are. And you got to give Lenny credit for his timing on his book.
Yes.
He had no way of knowing that this last 6 months was going to happen. But we're just it's sort of like a teaching aid that is showing us that if we ignore the poor, we ignore the ones we consider outcasts, there's common, if you're comfortable, oh, they're okay, it isn't as bad as you think, that isn't really happening. There's no denying what's been happening the last 4 months, that it wasn't happening. The people that were being, police that were being killed by the police. And when we get into the numbers of who is suffering the most from the virus, it's from the least of us that are suffering the most.
Yeah, in sort of the way I talked about how the cross reveals the lie of the Pax Romana. The cross reveals the brutality of Rome's system. So too, this virus is revealing the brutality of our society and all the people who suffer under it. Yeah. Greg, looks like you want to jump in.
Well, it looks like this is definitely the time to pivot. I mean, how many contemporary services are you going to add to think that you're going to grow the church? How many, new changes in worship book is going to grow the church? We've already proven that doesn't work. and the churches keep dying, why don't we lean into being different? Why don't we lean into being the rebels? Why don't we lean into being the game changers? One of the strangest things I heard, it was probably about 8 years ago, that in the Soviet Union, just to make it short, when the communist system collapsed, so did their social security system, so did the retirement system, everything collapsed. So did the mental health treatment, and so did addiction treatment. And the people who stepped in were the churches and said, we need to take care of our own, because they got rid of separation of church and state. And they said, we need to help our own people. And they started the recovery centers, and they started helping the seniors. And it was the churches that absorbed that. If we're going to keep dying and just keep saying, well, the church is dying and the zero zone, no zone up to the end of Alaska, that no one goes to church anymore, we have nothing to lose but to lean into being different, being the rebels, and being we're the people called to fight the system. We are the ones that can make the change. And what's the worst that can happen? You're going to die? Your church will die?
Yeah.
You won't be able to put a new carpet? I mean, that's the worst that could happen. Or we lean into it and we actually save the church.
I'm just going to say I agree with Greg.
I feel like the Gregs
Greg,
pretty in sync.
we're on board, which is good because there aren't too many of us named Greg around, but
It's a wonderful name, I always thought.
Raquel is insisting that she's on
Not
board too.
Greg.
And she's not a Greg.
She's
but,
not. Okay, well.
The crazy thing to me, I don't know if it's the best time to be a Christian. There's certainly more opportunities to be Christian now than it seems like there's been in a while. I mean, I don't know. That didn't come out right. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Never mind.
Well, let me jump in then, because I 100% agree with Lenny Duncan and with those of you who've spoken so far and Annalisa's heard me say this a lot, right? For 500, I mean, honestly, since Constantine, the church has been the default. And to say, if you're born into a Christian society, the idea is, well, you go to church because that's what you're supposed to do. And now, for the first time since Constantine, it's no longer assumed that people will go to church to fit in. Suddenly going to church, suddenly being a Christian requires a real choice. And what that allows us to do is to say, okay, let us be the church that Jesus calls us to be. We're not here to prop up the state. We're not here to function as a census to record every child who's born in our baptismal records, right? We're here to proclaim the gospel and to live it out, to bring forth the kingdom of God. And I 100% think the church will have to get smaller in order to do that, because the majority of people do not want to take up their cross and die. Most days, I don't want to do it. So there's a lot of people who will have to say, actually, I never really wanted to follow Jesus. I just wanted to fit in. And now I don't need to pretend anymore. So I can stop coming to church. And that frees up the rest of us to do the work that we're supposed to do. So I think I agree. I think it is the best time to be the church in 500 years. All right. So what's next? Specifically around the issues of racism, I'm trying to encourage our relationship with Bethel AME Church. I'm grateful for those of you who came this past Saturday. 12 of us from Faith Lutheran Church were there. I think we made up like half the workforce that day. Reverend Loretta was very grateful for our presence. And it's really fun to see just the broad support that Bethel's getting at this moment. We're trying to find a time to either have Reverend Loretta or the music minister, Robert, come in the next few months, and either preach or proclaim the gospel through music. We will, the next time there's another work day, I'll let the congregation know. We're also attempting to get 2 speakers to come and talk either on a Wednesday night via Zoom or after church via Zoom. We want one speaker to be from the Chico PD to have our local police talk about how they're addressing these issues. And we want one of those speakers to be from one of the advocacy groups in Chico that's pressing for police accountability, to hear what their perspectives are. That's essentially what your pastor and your council has planned around these issues, but I would love to hear from you. What do you see as next steps that we can do?
Can we do anything in anti-racism training?
We could, yeah. I'm sure Greg Hallman could perhaps suggest digital versions.
I think that's a possibility, but I think that, well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I feel like getting the congregation together for an in-person one would not be a great idea right now.
Yeah, right. How do you do it virtually? So
yeah.
I like the idea of having training type classes, because in the past, and other issues are no longer issues for us, we had trainings every 2-3 years on something, and for some people I think it just takes them that long.
Sure.
And I think we should respect that in people, that it's not all bad to want to hold on to the views you have, because some of those are important, but to let people gradually come to a new awakening, that's almost too fancy of a word, but a new realization. I think the more you do it, the better it is. And it clarifies it for people who think they know it all, sure, too.
Well, and as any of us who've tried to break a habit know, it takes a lot of work to change learned behavior.
That's what Mondays are for.
That's what Mondays are for. So yeah, we could look into some Zoom anti-racism training. I will say every time our seminary tried to have our anti-racism training, the trainers would invariably say something incredibly racist, and we'd have just huge incidents. So there's a part of me that's been very wary of doing that, because I've seen it go poorly many times.
I've been in many myself, and I think that's true. I think there's some really good trainers. And so I would hope that wouldn't be a cause not to engage it.
Yeah. Simply to say, I think I have been slow myself because of that reason, but I think you're right that we could find, well-spoken for trainers.
I'm also wondering, what are the possibilities of having some conversations with members of Bethel around the subject of racism, church, what keeps us from our church, just to be able, with people that we've already have a relationship with, and it would be if they were interested in that kind of a conversation, but to practice asking some of the questions that we need to learn to ask, and to listen also, so that we learn how it is for them to be, rather than just, thinking what we see is what it is. I would just like to have some conversations, and I was thinking that Bethel people might be a good place to do that. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that could be lovely. I'm always mindful of, forcing people of color to do the work of explaining to us racism. And so, I might look for opportunities where they have already volunteered to have some sort of forum or something, rather than say, hey, will you come and do this for us?
Right, and I agree with that. I don't think that's their job. I'm just looking for a place where they could ask questions. I mean, I think it needs to be something that would be helpful to both of us in the process.
And certainly, I think the more our congregations can build relationships with each other, the better. That might allow for some of that to occur naturally as well.
Might be easier, and I don't by easier mean easy, but to have, if we join together for different things, like if we had joint Bible studies where we went to each other's churches, and then everybody gets to know each other as people.
The idea of a joint.
Then when you know someone as a person, then those kind of things, have a different meaning than textbook definitions of things.
Yeah, I wonder. I think the idea of having a joint Bible study is fabulous. I wonder if, I'll talk to Reverend Loretta about that and see if that's something we might be able to do.
And since we're all Zooming these days.
Exactly. I was going to say, could be sort of the perfect time to do it. Yeah.
Something that I saw worked really well, that I went to one class in Asheville at the Lutheran church there, where my aunt and uncle go. They had, they put together their own talking points in education on what is racism, where have you seen it in your own life, and then asked the personal questions, and people shared how they feel like they've been racist. I also have been finding for myself that journaling about it, crying, going through the shame and the pain and all that stuff, talking here is really great, but I think this is really like more of an intellectual level, and I don't feel like things change as much on an intellectual level, but for me at least, that I need to go to more of an emotional level, and to reach that place, it can start with the intellect, but then going into deeper, like I've been taught with journaling, or in a deeper kind of discussion, where I begin to have a safe place to talk about where I think I'm racist, or where I can say like, oh, whoa, I didn't know that was racist, or I didn't know that was what it was, or I didn't know other people thought this way. Being able to say that kind of stuff, or go deeper, and whether or not I know I've been seeing that there are different people that have written and created workbooks and such for people to get to a deeper level too. And I didn't know if we could do any of those kind of things as a church too, because I want to keep going. I don't want this to stop.
Yeah, and I'm willing to bet some of those anti-racism trainings include, encouraging people to journal and dig deep and reflect in those ways. It looks like Greg Hallman has just shared with me a link. Is this one that you suggest where we might find some anti-racism training?
This is the Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack that I mentioned a few meetings ago.
That's great, yeah.
It just gives you a start in dealing with what white privilege looks like, and starts, challenging yourself on those questions. I was part of another group, Koinonia, that we called it, an examination of your consciousness. And this sort of takes you down that road of asking those questions of what does white privilege look like, and seeing if you're starting to be able to deal with it. Because undoing institutionalized racism, there's going to be a bunch of work that has to be done just by yourselves as white people, and you're going to have to get through it. And then there'll be other parts where you're exposing yourself to other people's institutionalized racism. But there's part of this that you're going to probably have to do privately or do in small groups. So you don't have those uncomfortable situations where, Pastor Ben says you're in a large group and someone says you are all racist, but there's no precursor to that, no explanation of it. And then people get defensive and they get hurt, and they don't work through it. And I keep saying work because all this is real work. Yep. So that's just the start of it.
Thank you. That's great. I think we got some wonderful action steps that we could do of looking into anti-racism training, looking into a joint Bible study, looking at some of the solo work we can do with the invisible knapsack. Yeah, we'll be working on putting these things together in the weeks and months ahead. But thank you for being faithful conversation partners for these past 5 weeks.
And Ben, I was just thinking when Greg mentioned about small groups this month, we can even do small groups on Zoom where people might feel more comfortable speaking than in a larger group. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think Greg's correct that, very hard to get honest, undefensive truth when you're, in front of a large group. And
Dinners for 8 on Zoom.
Yeah, and then actually that's one of the things we've been talking about. But even 8 might be too big.
Usually they recommend 2 to 3.
That makes sense.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, like I said, thank you. Let's close with the Lord's Prayer. And I invite you to once again start with calling God both Mother and Father. Our Mother, our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Pastor Ben.
Yes.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good
Bye.
night.